Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the School of Social and Political Sciences seminar series. I'm Rebecca Viney, a third-year SPS student here at York, and it's my pleasure to introduce our guest this afternoon, Professor Bev Skeggs, who's come from Goldsmiths University of London. Professor Skeggs is in the Department of Sociology, but has previously worked in Cultural Studies Department and Women's Studies Department, and has both studied and taught at our own University of York. Today's talk is entitled Caricature and Character, Performing Personhood on Reality Television, and Professor Skeggs will talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions that I'm sure will be prompted by the topic. So Let's give a warm welcome to Professor Skeggs.
Thank you. Now I did it so that they come in one line at a time. So this is really, really weird. I'll have to move forward and back. So I begin with a study from the 1980s. This is going to be going to get more exercise than I normally do. So a study from the 1980s, which was actually my PhD, which was a longitudinal study of white working class women in Crewe at the time. And I begin with this because it was all about respectability, and I'm currently working on a project on value and values. And what was very interesting when I was doing my most recent project on reality TV was how this book and voices in this book were haunting me. It was almost as if the political context was the same, like Thatcherism when I began this book and the massive cuts that were going on. And it was a study about how working class women were being made to go on caring courses, which were completely pointless, and then go in to do voluntary care in elderly people's homes, unpaid care. So it was looking at how the state was closing down and working class women were being educated out of the labour market. But it became, that's how it began, but it became after 11 years something kind of much more. So I'm going to keep running to put one point on at a time. I thought, I'll do it one point at a time so I can explain it, but this is going to be really, really bizarre. So just to say, it's based, the first points are based on a very particular moment, a historical moment, 1980s Thatcherism. Remember the date, Margaret Thatcher, 1979. And the original points are based on this. Since then, I've kind of the development of a theory that I've come to around personhood and person value actually comes from this, but I didn't realise that until a couple of years ago, so I've been working on that. So, right, I'm going to do one point at a time. Do excuse me. So, that was... Yes, I think it's okay, I'll just keep rolling. Thank you, though, thank you. So, that was a longitudinal ethnographic study, and it showed how working class women were positioned without value, and I'll explain this, and how their cultural dispositions were read on their body as pathology. They had bad bodies, their bodies were excessive, their bodies were in need of control, they were noisy, loud and badly behaved. Their teachers thought that all they would do would leave school, have babies and be completely pointless. So it wasn't kind of a productive, positive educational experience. So they were completely devalued in lots of places, but they did have value in their local labour market. So I used Pierre Bourdieu's work, which I'll go on to look at, to understand how values have different value in different places. Now, what the whole book's about is how they reworked their devaluation through the claim for respectability. They would say, I am respectable, I know how to clean better than our teachers, I know how to cook better than our teachers, I can look after children, I can look after elderly people better than our teachers. So they were continually claiming respectability through everything. The book is kind of a study of how they do this through where they live, the clothes they wear, how they speak, because they try to change the way they speak in different ways, and the cultural practices. So they to make the point that some people have said that means they wanted to be middle class. They didn't. They resolutely wanted to have value and did not want to be middle class. And there's a whole thing in the book about why. And I'm going to skip through it quite quickly. And I show how they get trapped into this investment in being caring, in being respectable, in being domestic and in being feminine because of the investments that they make over time in their struggle to gain value. So investment is absolutely key to understanding what they do, and struggle for value in the face of constant devaluation is absolutely central. And I show how they're trapped. And the argument of the book is that class is lived at the intimate level on the basis of judgment. Being judged by others constantly is absolutely key. So judgment practice and how they feel their affect was central to the production of their subjectivity. And so I argue that class is a relationship. It's a dialogic relationship between those who judge and those who are judged, those who can authorise their judgment and those who cannot. So very important. The encounter that enables the judgment to be made is crucial to how we understand class. So this isn't a study of stratification. It's not a study of traditional sociology of class. It's a study of the relationships of class. So you can see its history comes from kind of a Marxist feminist background. And I look at the significance of the gaze, the look that enables you to feel you are rubbish, basically, or enables you to make somebody else feel they are rubbish, depending on who's doing it. I've since realised in other research, and I've done quite a lot of research since, that the gaze, the very quick gaze, is absolutely central to how people live relationships of class. So people know they're being looked at. And having kind of changed positions, and we can talk about that, I've seen that work in different ways. The big argument of the book is that, and you can question me, this is the bit that people kind of always question me on, is that these women did not want to be called working class because the term working class precisely meant they were devalued. Working class was a term of devaluation. To call somebody working class, even in the 80s, nothing like, and it gets worse, this is what I'm going to say. Even in the 80s, they did not want, because for a working class woman to be called working class was to be recognised as being pathological, to be excessive, to likely be excessively fecund, to breed too much, to not get married and be respectable, to have too many children and to be on state benefits. So the term working class, as I chart carefully, I'm not just making the assumptions that I chart that carefully, the term working class was something they didn't want, but I, as the researcher, did call them working class because I was a sociologist, and I realised they were positioned by class, and the term, the idea of class, is a symbolic name, and I wanted to use it for the purposes of analysis, not for the purposes of judgment. And then I go into a big debate about femininity, and part of the whole class relationship is about morality. So to summarise, because I'm going to go into another research project, so this is just like a quick background. So the main points that I really want to stress from this earlier study, because this all turns into a theory of person value at the end, is that their life was based on a struggle for recognition of value, to be seen to be a valuable person, to not be seen as problematic and pathological. And they realised that they were implicated in a struggle because they knew that they were being misrecognised. So when they had the encounter, and people would kind of go, oh, you're just going to have kids, you're pointless, there's no point educating you, you don't know how to do this, or, you know, you're just having too much sex, or whatever, you know, the encounter, they would argue they were being misrecognised. It's a really key, it's a bit like investment, it's a term that can be used in psychoanalysis as well as kind of through feminist and Marxist theory. But misrecognition was crucial. They knew they were not being recognised as the value that they saw themselves to be. And I argue this is because symbolically they were historically read as lack. And if you do, there's some fantastic work on the history of working class women. They are blamed for everything. They're blamed for wars, they're blamed for contagion, they're blamed for like the problems of middle class men not behaving well, they're blamed for bad art. I mean, there's fantastic stuff by people like Sonia Rose. Every time there's a national crisis, working class women are usually seen to be the problem in some way. They're having too many babies, they're dirty. You know, you think about the kind of the unredeemable working class women in Victorian literature. Always cause problems. So they are, you know, the irrational, the unreasonable, and the badly behaved. And so they were subject to misrecognition. Now, what was interesting, they didn't really understand why they were subject to bad devaluation. They couldn't work out why, because they did think they were good people. They were kind, they were caring, they were respectable. So there was always a bit of perplexity. Now, what was interesting is that they started to understand why when they could link the affect that they felt to the idea of class. So there's some really important work that you can trace back into Spinoza's theories of power about when affect gets connected to idea, it can make sense of the feeling. And I argue if class is a feeling, if it's something that's really experienced as painful, as difficult, as a struggle, when it gets connected to a wider idea, they began to understand why they were misrecognised. They began to understand why people were judging them as useless when they didn't think they were. So the idea of connecting the affect to the idea becomes pretty critical, and incredibly critical when it comes to reality TV, which is what I'm moving into. Now, I'm just going to very quickly, literally, go into Bourdieu, because even in 1980, I was working with Bourdieu, and the reason I really like Bourdieu is he has the term cultural capital. So he has economic capital, symbolic capital, social capital. But for me, it was cultural capital. These people, these women, were being judged in terms of their lack of cultural capital. That meant they couldn't exchange their other capitals to increase their economic value. The cultural capital was what trapped them. So I put together Pierre Bourdieu with Judith Butler to understand how gender and class work together. And so Bourdieu says that all these capitals congeal in the body and create dispositions. And he talks about, and this is why I have to do this in very short notes, he talks about volume of capitals and composition of capitals. But the dispositions are really, really you have to sit here. This might be even more confusing. But he puts them together. He puts composition over time, volume over time into dispositions. So how we develop the dispositions of our own body, how we learn to be confident, how we learn to be entitled, or how we learn to be cramped, and how we learn to be judged. And there's a whole chapter in the book about how the women won't go into spaces where they know they're going to be judged because it's just too painful. And they talk about going into Kendall's in Manchester, and they call that a really posh shop, and they have a bad experience, and so they don't go there ever again. So they learn not to occupy spaces where they will experience a bad encounter of misrecognition, devaluation, and which will make them feel shame. So I use Bourdieu to kind of argue that it's because of the capitals that they hold in their body produces forms of embodiment, and it's the embodiment that they then live as dispositions. Now, what's interesting, when I was, I can't really say I was forced, but when I decided that to run a conference on feminism and Bourdieu with Lisa Adkins, I then had to go right through the whole of Bourdieu and decide why I didn't like the concept habitus, which I never use, but why I thought Bourdieu was both important but not important. So I think he's incredibly important on cultural capital, but I don't think he can understand gender. I think Bourdieu is a theory of power. It's a brilliant theory of power. It's how the middle class live, it's how they inhabit power, it's how they have entitlement, it's how they have confidence, it's how they can occupy space, how they feel they can do anything. So it's a real theory of space and power, but it is not a theory of those who do not have power. And so if you actually look at Bourdieu in detail, what you find is that his understanding of the working class is as lack. So it's a theory of social reproduction as social reproduction. There's a real problem with understanding a theorist who just says the working class are lack. Now, of course he does, because they are, if you're describing who has capitals, they have lack. But what I want to argue, and it hinges around the concept cultural capital, is that if we understand cultural capital differently, we may be able to see how the working classes can have value, and we may be able to stop all of our theoretical understandings being premised upon understanding the working classes as lacking. And so what I do argue in various different places that a lot of academic theorists and reality TV producers are very, very similar. So in the end, I argue we need to think differently, we need to look differently, but Bourdieu is a very good starting point for looking differently and seeing differently. So, what's changed? What's changed since the 1980s? And when I said I was haunted when I was doing the reality TV research, So I did bring that because this was a very long project. I'll show you. It was from 2005, no, in the next slide, till 2008. Ended up in this book, which is probably only like a tenth of the research that we did. But what's changed between that project, and even though I did projects on sexuality and ex-offenders and all sorts of things in the middle, but really it's these two that connects the most in terms of class and gender. What's changed is symbolic devaluation. So if you think that for Bourdieu, if your cultural capital is to have any value, it has to become symbolic. It has to be legitimated. So it has to be capital that has a value when you exchange it. So for instance, if you have knowledge of art history, it's not that hard to get a job as a museum curator. You know how to occupy that world. You have the knowledge, you have the confidence, you have the entitlement. You do go into museums, you know what they are, and you can do it. If you don't have that cultural capital, you can't do it. You cannot convert your cultural capital into symbolic value and then into economic value. It's just impossible. You don't have it. You don't have access, you don't have the resources, and you can't convert. Really important. So symbolic capital for Bourdieu is the really powerful form of cultural capital. It's the capital that really counts. It's legitimate capital. Really, really, really important. It has to be legitimate. So what's changed is we have an intensification of symbolic devaluation. So even though the poor women in formations of class and gender are being humiliated and shamed and subject to devaluation, it's nothing like as bad as it is now. And now we have the whole of a particular genre of TV, which is infectious and contagious and spreads into various different forms, actually portraying in public working class women as deficit, lack, problematic, excessive and pathological. So what's changed is a massive amount and intensification and amplification of symbolic delegitimation. Massive amounts of symbolic violence, I'd argue, being done to working class women. And it's women in particular. And a really good question Rebecca asked me before is, why is it women? Well, kind of working class men are less interesting in many ways. They've always been depicted as violent. So we did have a series in the 1980s about dangerous dogs and dangerous men, and Channel 4, I don't know if anybody probably won't remember it, but had white working class men in Stoke-on-Trent fighting dogs. So that, that's the kind of limit to the working class men stuff. They are often instead glamorised. If you think of all the TV programmes and films, like Madonna's ex-partner Guy Ritchie, I've forgotten all the names of the films, but it's all about the glamorisation of working class male violence. It's an entirely different, you do not get the glamorisation of working class women in the same way. Think about Jordan in comparison to kind of gangster culture. It's really, really different. It's a whole gender politics to how working class people's cultural capital is used. And a really important question was, how does this work in terms of race? Well, it would be very difficult for TV producers to start humiliating, shaming and attacking black working class people or South Asian working class people because they'd be accused of being racist. And the thing that most TV producers want to be is liberal. It adds value to their CV, basically. It adds value to their possibility to get a job. So if they're ever accused of racist, they'd never get another job. Think about the Jade Goody thing and how the whole country, all the TV producers and politicians came out and went, we're not racist, when of course it's the anti-performative, which means of course you are if you have to say it like that. So anyway, back to the notes. They are still there. They are still there. I knew I'd go off. So it's the hatred that's the problem now. There's been a massive amount of hatred in British society that has become legitimate. And I nearly died when I saw the book by Ferdinand Mount. And not many of you will know Ferdinand Mount. Ferdinand Mount was Margaret Thatcher's policy advisor. He's an aristocrat. He was pretty evil as an architect of cuts in welfare and hatred of working class women, various different things if you go back. He wrote a book, and the quote's up there. He wrote a book called Mind the Gap. And he says, you can't believe it when you read it. He talks about chav scum. How did Ferdinand Mount find chav scum is another interesting thing, but he talks about the hatred against the working class. And as an aristocrat, he finds this deplorable. Because again, historically, there's been a very interesting relationship between aristocrats and working class. They always get on a lot better because they don't have a moral agenda in the same way. That's just to cut a huge amount of history short. But Ferdinand Mount says it's a site where hatred almost explodes off the computer scene. And then he says, the bottom quote here, "What I do not think many people have yet woken up to is the working class has been subjected to a sustained programme of social contempt and institutional erosion, which has persisted through many different governments and several political fashions." The fact that he was like crucial in organising this, he doesn't say, but I argue he's onto something. I never thought I'd quote Margaret Thatcher's policy advisor, but hey, it's kind of to say, look, even he notices this. And lots of other people notice it in lots of different arenas. David Garland's work on criminology looks at kind of what's going on in various different areas. Now, I think what we see with reality TV is the most amazing spectacle of this hatred. And so, this is the project. It was funded by the ESRC. It's for the Identities and Social Action Programme. We finished it in 2008. And we did, I'm going to skip through these very, very quickly. We did, and it was hell. I can honestly say it was hell, and I'm very pleased I don't have to watch these programmes anymore. We were going to watch them like all week long, and we couldn't bear it. We had to have breaks after 2 days. We watched, in the end, we cut it down to 10 self-transformation programmes. We decided to do that because programmes like Big Brother, which are the psychological experiment programmes, are actually doing something different, and then they become freak shows, so we're really pleased we didn't do them. So we're looking at self-transformation because we're looking at the programmes that identify a lack and then say this lack needs resolving in particular ways. And so we went through all the different subgenres of TV, internet, magazines, and intertextual analyses. It was a huge, huge problem. When we began the project, and we wrote the proposal in 2003, there were about 10 reality TV programmes. When we ended it, there were thousands, literally thousands, and I'll explain why, but a really big problematic. We also had a huge problem with the textual analysis because we said we'd do intertextual analysis. We'd look at how it's circulated, how it's talked about, what happens. But it's a transnational object. The money that's made out of reality TV is usually through franchising. It's not necessarily through audiences anymore. It's transnational, so you've got things like what not to wear in Iran. You've also got incredible kind of programs in Colombia, so we couldn't keep track of what was going on basically. And then we had the celebrity scandals, so the Jade Goody thing where Gordon Brown, who was then the Chancellor, Shadow Chancellor, had to apologise for Jade Goody to the Indian Prime Minister. I was in New Zealand at the time, in the middle of the countryside, wondering what the hell's going on here? And it was a reality TV person. And it was to basically say the nation's not racist. So that's just to give you some sense of the intertextual scope of this project. It became massive. Now, what I've missed out here somehow, I've missed it. We used 3 different stages of empirical methods. We did 40 interviews, and we had 4 different groups. So we had one predominantly white working class group, but with some white and some black. We had a predominantly black working class group. We had a mixed middle class group, and we had a South Asian mixed group. And we began with interviews to locate their positions, their use of television. If you do media studies, you kind of know that you've got to do all that kind of mapping. We then developed a thing called the effective textual encounter, where we watched people watching television to see how they reacted. Because if you think from the previous studies, we knew affect was significant, how people kind of respond with shame and humiliation. We wanted to see how that works. So it's not a reading, and it's not a meaning analysis. It's an effective understanding of how the media works and circulates. And then we did focus groups, and these were fantastic, the focus groups, because people performed the focus group. So the Broccoli Black Working Class group ran the focus group as an Oprah Winfrey programme, which was kind of like, that was a gift almost. Interestingly, the South Asian group used it to have a party amongst themselves, a legitimate excuse to be out of the home. They made loads and loads of food, and every time we tried to intervene and ask them a question, they ignored us. So the transcript from the Broccoli one's about this thick, the transcript from the South Asian group's about this thick. So the methods were very revealing, and we've written about methods quite a lot because they're very significant to what we found. Then we did focus groups, and then we kept generating analysis from each stage. This is to show you when we began the project itself in November 2005, this was just a listing of the terrestrial programs. So you can just see there's a lot. That's just to say there's a lot. This is how we broke it all down, so you can see how we did it. That's genres down the left and format across the right. You will notice that there's a huge gap missing from the genres. We forgot to include property programs, which, guess what, became highly significant with our middle class group. That was the only reality TV apart from Super Nanny that they watched. So we had to kind of quickly get back and understand those. So that was quite a difference. You can see how we were trying to organise this ever-changing object, right? But what's also really significant, and I think this is what is so important, is that it's the political economy of television that's radically changing. So again, significant year, 1979, the deregulation of TV. Independent production companies have to be used. Everybody starts competing against each other. There's the opening out of all the airwaves, and everybody's trying to do the cheapest TV they possibly can just to survive and take a hold in the market. And I think the real problem about the political economy is people do stop trying to produce the cheapest TV possible. So what you have are production companies with only 3 people. I once actually worked for one where I did the sound, the filming and the interviewing. I've never used a camera before, and as you can imagine, it wasn't very successful. It wasn't very good. They were phenomenally cheap programs and phenomenally cheap TV. They have started having much higher production values, some of them, but they are a very cheap form. The people who participate on them don't get paid. You've also got the destruction of the unions in television. So all the skilled workers, the sound recordists, a lot of them unemployed, and people like me were asked to do things for digital TV companies, just because I was there, really. But what's also really significant is a number of people who were trying to get jobs in TV had to use these independent production companies as a route. And sometimes they're on like 1-week contracts. So people who are trying to recruit, I forgot what they're called, the people who try to recruit the participants are often on like performance-related pay. So that if they can't find enough freaks to recruit to particular programs, they never get recruited again. And only about 10% of the people who start working on these programs ever get a job. Interestingly, they all say they want to work on documentaries and real programs. But I think they would say that, apart from one of the producers of Big Brother who defends everything he does. But they know that it's a kind of really cutthroat world. It's a very particular class composition, because to succeed in TV independent production, you have to be able to live in London, live on 1-week contracts, and survive phenomenal working hours. And it's all performance related. Now the medium's based on sensation. If you do not get enough sensation in order to be able to sell your product to another country, the form of franchise, that's it, you go under. There's no kind of the BBC nice kind of bed anymore. You have to keep selling the product, and it's all performance related. So the people who are trying to get jobs doing reality TV are under huge amounts of pressure. So what do? They rely on lazy formulas. One was a success. Ibiza Uncovered was a success. Let's have 500 more of them in different countries with even worse people. Wife Swap was a success to begin with for quite a long while, actually. Let's choose even more extreme people. Now, some of the adverts for these TV shows, and it's so upsetting because I had it on the web, but they've removed it and I didn't save it. One of the characters was called Lizzie Bardsley. Anybody remember Lizzie? From Wife Swap in 2003. Why would you? Lizzie Bardsley was like the best example of everything I've been talking about. She was large, she was white, she had asthma, she smoked, she had 8 children, she was on the dole, and Poor Lizzie was actually very, very fragile. She was in a very, very bad state, and the programme is absolutely horrific to watch because she kind of falls apart in the middle of it. But in typical kind of working class fashion, instead of falling apart in a quiet crying sort of way, she gets very angry and very loud and behaves very, very badly. So it's a kind of exposition of that really kind of excessive behaviour in every way. Now they kept, at Wife Swap, kept advertising for another Lizzie Bardsley for about 3 years after that programme. And they kept trying to find even more excessive versions of Lizzie Bardsley. So it's a kind of real sensational medium that works through producing sensation. You know, think about some of the most shocking reality TV programmes you've ever seen. Can you think? Have you seen any reality TV programmes? The How Clean Is Your House? The bacteria in men's underpants. That's one I've never got over. There was 1,002 bacteria in a male student's underpants. Yeah, don't want to go there. So, you know, there's some really extreme ones. They're getting more and more extreme, as you can imagine, because they've got to keep up in the ante. So now we have supposedly the interest of education, all the embarrassing body ones, all the sex performance ones. I don't think there's anything that has not been on. In fact, I challenge you to think of anything that has not been covered on reality TV in the interest of sensation. That's a challenge, because I haven't come up with one. So really, what's the key to all these? And in the end, after doing all those genres, is to break it down into 3 different performance requirements. Abject TV, that is the Ibiza Uncovered, which there's a Greek one, isn't there now? Is it Greek? Yeah, there's a Greek one on at the moment, and it has got more extreme. I think it's really funny that the kind of the mutation of Ibiza Uncovered now is sexual diseases. So instead of just like filming people vomiting, having sex and getting run over and getting locked up, now they all come back with syphilis or something. So it is kind of getting more and more and more extreme. And then the transformation of the self. Interestingly, it began with Wife Swap, Super Nanny. These have become much more attempts to educate, which we can see from the audience figures are becoming much less successful. When What Not to Wear tried to do psychology education, it failed completely. Really, it's just about the clothes. So they do mutate, and they have to kind of keep finding that which will interest the audience. And then the other one is expert transformation. Now these usually, if they don't try to do anything else, the expert transformation are often the most successful, because everybody thinks they just like tips and they're not being moralised. So out of them all, if you look, these are the most successful. So what I'll do is kind of show you some examples. That really is. It goes on and on and on. If you want to watch the whole thing, you can see it. But it is about excess. What Michelina has to do is tone down her excess in every way. And she's learnt that everybody is judging her as excessive. Her work colleagues, her husband, her friends. So she has to learn that, and she has to take that humiliation. Now, interestingly, it plays out quite differently in our focus groups. Now, So this one this is a hilarious programme, but it only ran for 2 seasons. It's called What the Butler Saw. And people have to compete to be lords and ladies. And of course they fail, you can imagine. How would people understand? But what I think is really interesting is Tiffany on the Phone is particularly excessive. And then the other one, which became, I've written a whole paper on this one, because this is very, very sad. But just to point out something. So this is Wife Swap. Michelle and Barry. Michelle has been married to Barry for, forgotten how many years. It's years and years and years, like 25 years, and he's never made her a cup of tea. And Barry just goes to the gym, fills in his bookie. I mean, Barry was a gift to the searcher, the recruiters, the people who found them. And so what we see, this is the kind of classic end piece of Wife Swap. Wife Swap is nearly always, I haven't watched it actually for about a year, thank goodness, but it was always about an aspirational working class woman versus a excessively bad working class woman. So here we see Michelle. Now what's interesting, and I'm going to come to our audience responses just before I end, is just to show you this bit. So where is the point of Michelle's value? When she finds out that her husband has actually been talking to another woman, like talking, 15 years he's never talked to her, and making another woman that he swapped with a cup of tea. Where does she try and retrieve her value from? Domestos and washing up. So there's the value struggles in that. This is there's a big analysis of this one. But that's all I'm going to go into on those. There are lots more, and I can show you lots more if you want them. So I just want to show you this, because what I think is significant is, since 1979, so since the Formations of Class and Gender project, there's been a massive rise in inequality, a huge gap between the richest and the poorest in the UK. Massive. Still going on. And what I think these programmes do, and this is why at the end of the book I kind of went into a rant, and Helen, was writing with me, but we thought that what we saw has been this massive kind of increase in inequality and a complete justification of why these people who are often on welfare benefits, if you notice, a lot of them are in northern cities. They're in northern cities where there are no jobs. Even Fairy Job Mother. Did anybody ever watch that? Fairy Job Mother went to Middlesbrough, and they were the BBC, and they could not find a job. It's like most people will offer up a job to the BBC. There are no jobs, but these people are being blamed for being pathologically unemployable. So I think there's and I know I'm making a huge jump here, and I do make it very carefully elsewhere, but I think what this does is symbolic delegitimation on the basis of the participants' cultural capital on reality TV. These programmes justify the cuts on the poorest. These programmes justify all the government's proclamations of welfare benefit scroungers, all the justifications of working class women having too many children, all the justifications of people not looking for work. They justify them because they show them behaving badly. They show them behaving badly in a variety of different situations, usually situations not of their own making, in which they do not have the cultural capital to handle, to deal with, or to know how to behave. And so I do see reality television as one element of ideological devaluation. And I use the term specifically. I go back to ideology. I began in 1980 with ideology and then lost it. But now I go back to it because I do think I use ideology in terms of repetitive history. So it's not a kind of conspiracy, even though it's probably sounded like that. It's about repeating history easily by those who have power, those who don't bother taking responsibility for the representations that they produce. So I think it's just one element. And I see these struggles going on. So I see this as part of a struggle between those who need jobs in TV and those who are subject to these programmes. So I see it as a kind of class struggle writ large, where people have to spectacularly perform their behaviour. Now, what's significant, I've got this and then her final conclusion, is that when we did all the audience research, so we began with all the texts, and we were like, oh my God, this is symbolic violence, this is horrific, I never want to watch these programmes. And I ended up having arguments with lots of people about them. But when we did the audience research, what's really interesting is the ideology is not working directly in terms of class. The people who these programmes are meant to be directed to, those who've been identified as pathological and in need of transformation, don't think the programmes are addressed to them. They just think, oh, they're just idiots behaving badly and they're just one-offs and they're not kind of representative in any way. What's really interesting is that the people who do believe them are the middle classes. Our middle class audience group talked about, stupid people doing stupid things. What's also very interesting is they recognise redeeming features. Not a single person in any of our focus groups thought Michelina deserved to be humiliated and shamed in that way. People were very resistant to the cruelty of the television. Now, I take great hope from that because I think we're living in a moment of really cruel conservatism, and I take hope in the fact that people do not like cruelty. They do not like millionaires taking, £4 a week off really, really poor people. So I'm hoping that that kind of response to cruelty will disperse throughout society. They also rejected the authority of the judges. So when they look at somebody like Trinny, they go, but look at the state of her. So again, a bit like the perplexity of our formations of class and gender women, they can't understand why these people are sent to judgment when they look so bad themselves. And they recognise redeeming features. So, you know, Jordan, who's probably, along with Jay Goody, the most vilified working class women on television, are seen to be really good mothers. They respect them because they really care for their children. So I argue that they have an entirely different value system, and we have to see cultural capital in it in an entirely different way. They're also very, very anti-instrumental, so I think that's very good for the moment and what's significant. So in conclusion, I just want to say, although there's this repeated, and ideology works very powerfully when it gets repeated constantly over history, over time, over space. So we just learn to recognise things. The repeated formulas, which you kind of writ large in reality TV, don't work for the working class, who it's expected to target. They do work for the middle class, who do think that these people are very stupid and doing silly things. But where I do think, and this is a whole other paper and I'm not going into it, but I'm going to end on it, where I do think ideology works is through motherhood. It's impossible to be a good mother. You are always criticised, you're always subject to criticism in some way about something. And if anybody ever looks at Mumsnet, I call that hate speech, but you know, the attacks on Mumsnet on other mothers are kind of quite extraordinary. So it's sort of motherhood and gender in particular. So class and class politics are being challenged. They're not being accepted at all, but the gender politics are. And it's working in very different ways. And I think it's important that we look at both class and gender to see how this works out. And so I think for the women, like Michelle, who went, you didn't clean the house, where the source of value is either motherhood or domesticity rather than exploitation. They choose motherhood or domesticity, but then they're revealed to be lacking. But I think that's why we need an entirely different understanding of how cultural capital works, how personhood's formed, and I want to argue for a different theory of person value to that which is normally circulated in sociological theory. Okay, thank you.